Story 1. While being transported from the airport to the hotel in Morocco, the cab driver asked, "American?" I replied, "Yes." His response was, "Ah, yes. Bill Clinton." Story 2. An international student from Malta and I were hanging out at the smokers' lounge, the area in front of the dorms where people smoked. A raccoon popped out of one of the trash cans, and he freaked out, saying that the animals in North America were the size of monsters. Story 3. I worked with a German man once. Somehow, the History Channel came up in conversation. "Ah, the Hitler Channel," he remarked. I chuckled. Story 4. A guy from the UK I know loves to refer to Americans as melon farmers. He calls them melon farming imbeciles. If he doesn't know what an object I refer to is, it must be some kind of weird melon farming contraption. Where have I been the last few days? I must have been tending to my melon farm. I wish I had a backyard instead of a dull asphalt apartment parking lot. I must be missing life back on my melon farm. It's really strange. Story 5. A Chinese exchange student in college could not understand the concept of yo mama jokes. He ran into the room in nothing but a towel and yelled, "Yo mama is not good," before shimming away. Story 6. A French man asked me if we really put ranch dressing on everything. I replied, "Yes, even on salad." And he stared at me as if I had just admitted to living in a dumpster. Story 7. A Persian man I worked with did a redneck impression. He said, "I'm an American, and I like guns and Jesus," in a perfect Southern accent. Story 8. Do you have any permanent houses? The man I knew in college was from rural Kenya. Apparently, his temporary house was constructed of wood. People who had gained enough wealth no longer had a wooden house. Story 9. A waiter in Prague asked where I was from. I told him I was from Boston. He said, "Oh, I have a friend named Tomas Dvorak who lives in Wyoming. Do you know him?" Story 10. I am in Paris with my wife, and we booked a professional photographer for an hour. He kept telling us that his favorite thing about America was that there was a pharmacy on every corner. I told him that the best part about Paris is that there is not a pharmacy on every corner. It was a funny moment. Story 11. When I studied in Germany, my host family told me, "We bought a lot of peanut butter for you. We know Americans need peanut butter." I do love peanut butter, but I had never heard that stereotype before. Story 12. Are cheerleaders real? A teenager in London in 2006 wondered about this. Cheerleaders appeared in movies, but the teenager had no idea if that was a real thing. It was a charming conversation. Story 13. A British friend of mine called Southern Sweet Tea the most vile, disturbing, horrific beverage ever created. Please bring another pitcher. Story 14. I was at the Grand Tetons when a group of older Korean men asked if I was Mormon. I replied, "No, sorry, we're not from here." They all started giggling and said, "We're not from here either." It was so adorable, and we all had a good laugh. Story 15. I am the foreigner in this case. My uncle misled me for years regarding the meaning of red and blue states. I was about 4 years old during the 2000 election, and we had family dinner once a week. Before dinner, we would usually watch television. At that time, the big news was about George Bush's victory in the election, and they would show all the infographics. I asked my uncle why some places were blue and others were red. He told me that in the blue states you were allowed to wear blue but not red and vice versa. He maintained this for years, even into my teens. As a non-American, I never cared to look into it, and as a 4-year-old, I didn't understand the concept of a political party, so I just took him at face value. Fast forward to 2010. I was now 14, and my family went on vacation to Florida. I was walking around and saw people wearing both red and blue. We went to a restaurant, and I asked the waiter why people were wearing both when it was only legal to wear one or the other. My mother was mortified. Story 16. I was at an airport in line at a Wolfgang Puck Express. A man in front of me saw the margarita pizza and asked for one slice. The worker said it was only sold as a whole pizza. The man, incredulous, turned to me and jokingly said, "This is why Americans are so overweight," before leaving. I then ordered the same margarita pizza. Story 17. My coworkers all wished me a happy holiday with my family before St. Patrick's Day. I am not Irish, just the only white person on the team. Story 18. There is an Airbnb on my street. I was walking to my car one day, and these three youngsters who had just turned 21 were staring at me as my wife and I were walking out to my car. Two of them looked away, but one kept staring, so I gave him a nod, signaling to keep it moving. The kid yelled out, "Hey, do you want to give us a ride to the pub?" It made me laugh pretty hard. I was driving past the bar anyway, so I said, "Yeah, hop in." We spent about 5 minutes in the car, and they were telling me, "This place isn't like everybody says." Huh? I haven't seen a single gun the whole time I've been here. That's when I had to let them know that people with guns don't want you to know they have them. We don't walk around with them in our hands all day. He asked if I owned guns, and I laughed, saying, "There's a gun in this car right now. You think I'd let three young kids in my car without one? I'm from the neighborhood." Story 19. I used to work in a kitchen at a Mexican restaurant, and two of the cooks, who were brothers, were learning English. They were in high school at that time, so they were picking up a lot of slang as well. They thought it was very strange how we say, "I feel you," when we agree with someone. Every time I say it now, I can't help but think about how unusual it actually is. Story 20. My fiancé from the Netherlands asked what the zebra road sign meant that he kept seeing everywhere. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about at first. It was the crossing sign. Story 21. My wife's cousins from Sweden thought they could explore both New York City and Los Angeles in a single weekend. Story 22. I had some visitors from Japan who asked if they could visit the West Coast for an afternoon. I explained that it was about 3,000 miles away and would take several days to drive there. Story 23. When I was 13, I was in Paris with my French friend, and we went to the Paris McDonald's. Just before we took our food to the table to sit and eat, I did the mom grab and took as many napkins as I could fit into a handful. My friend said, very alarmed and aggressive, "Michael, this is a restaurant, not your house." Story 24. My German teaching assistant in college said she was going to drive to New York City that weekend to see Times Square. We were in West Texas and had to explain why that was essentially impossible. Story 25. I once had a tourist ask me to take their picture with the Empire State Building in the background. I explained to them that the building behind them was the Chrysler Building and not the Empire State Building. They didn't understand and still wanted a picture. They flew all the way around the world to take the wrong picture. Story 26. I was at a pub in Italy with a friend when some of the guys discovered we were American. They proceeded to take shots with us, toasting, "To the Ohios. We're actually not from Ohio." Story 27. My Chinese dorm mate sometimes struggles with English, so when she walked in on me cooking completely handmade enchiladas, she was surprised and asked what it was. When I told her and demonstrated how to make it, she beamed, started bouncing in excitement, and said, "I didn't know you liked Mexican food." It was genuinely adorable, and we both laughed. I guess she had never heard the word Mexican in English, so she just improvised. Story 28. Not said but done. When an international student removed her top at a public pool and unintentionally created quite a scene. Story 29. I went on an exchange trip to southern Germany during high school, and one of the day trips was to visit a local elementary school. Many children asked us why we weren't overweight and if all Americans really owned guns. One child asked if we all lived in New York City. They were really cute, but there was some evident stereotyping. Similarly, my brother's exchange partner, also from Germany, saw all the squirrels around our house and exclaimed, "Ah, rats." Story 30. My brother had a college roommate from Yemen whom he brought home for Christmas one year. It was really snowy, and he wanted to go out and make some cookies. Took us a while to figure it out, but he meant donuts in the van. That was about 20 years ago, and I still laugh. Story 31. I have caused several incidents as a foreigner living in the United States, if that counts. This includes not understanding the protocol when your car is stopped by the police for speeding. Apparently, you are meant to stay seated, turn on the interior light, and place your hands on the dashboard. That is not what I did. I jumped out of the car and asked what the matter was. I couldn't tell who was more startled, me or them. When I was angrily asked if I had never been stopped for speeding before, I replied, "No, we just have speed cameras do that back home." They didn't take that well either. As for general misunderstandings, I have experienced more than I can count. When I first arrived, I tried to plan a road trip to Texas. I was quite shocked to learn just how much distance that was. I also quickly stopped calling my underwear knickers. When I saw the horrified looks and how it made everyone turn with whiplash speed to our black colleagues. Story 32. I told someone who wanted to visit both coasts in a couple of days. It takes about 8 hours to fly from one side of our country to the other. He responded, "Do American planes not fly as fast as those in other countries?" Story 33. This wasn't directed at me, but I'll never forget seeing a viral Tumblr post where someone said, "I was today years old when I learned that Country Roads, Take Me Home is in fact not your national anthem." Not the exact wording because I can't remember, but I thought it was hilarious. Story 34. I was sitting outside a coffee shop after finishing a 2-mile walk with my 125-pound Labrador Mastiff mix. An Eastern European man I casually knew sat at the table next to me. The dog was lying in the shade on the concrete, in the space between the front bumper of my car and the sidewalk. An SUV that probably cost $100,000 pulled into the space next to my car. An extremely attractive woman, adorned with jewels and carrying a recognizable designer bag, exited the SUV. She immediately noticed my dog, bent down, and began to give him belly rubs. I thanked her, and she smiled as she walked away. I heard a heavily accented Slavic voice say to me, "It's good to be a dog in America." Story 35. The way they discuss American cheese, as if it is the only type of cheese available in the United States. The process used to make American cheese was originally invented in Switzerland. Story 36. I experienced Irish men in a cafe teasing my sister and me for being California girls who prefer almond milk in our lattes. The entire restaurant laughed because it was both amusing and accurate. During my visit to St. Lucia, the taxi drivers would inquire about my origins, and when I mentioned California, they would respond with references to Kobe Bryant and the governor. For context, the Irishmen worked at the cafe in Dublin, and we were on their territory. Story 37. My 6-year-old cousin from the mountains of Zakopane, Poland, visited Philadelphia recently. We were driving around, and he said to his mom, in Polish, "Wow, I had no idea how rich everyone was in America. Look at how big their houses are." She translated for us, and we were surprised. Then he said, "I just don't know why they need so many doors and windows for their houses." He was looking at our row homes and thought a block was one big house. When she explained that they were all separate houses, he replied, "Oh." Story 38. A Belgian once told me she had no interest in visiting the United States because she preferred nature and open spaces. Story 39. While in Japan, a young lady who had visited the United States stated she was astonished by the amount of land used for parking lots. Story 40. A French man at a bar in Paris couldn't believe that we had more varieties of beer than just Budweiser or Bud Light. I tried to explain that there was a bar where I lived with probably 50 beers on tap, all made in my small Midwestern state alone. I couldn't convince him that there are thousands of craft beers in the United States. Story 41. Why does no one drink tea? This was asked at a restaurant when coffee was offered, which was humorous because tea was also an option. I'm not saying the tea was particularly good, but it was still tea. Story 42. I was telling a group of Czech people about a time I drove to Manhattan, and one of them asked me if that was possible because it is an island. I informed her that there are bridges. Story 43. A coworker who was elderly and a recent immigrant from India asked me if hot dogs were made from dogs. Story 44. Had to have a sensitive conversation in a university in the United States with a friend from Ireland. He kept telling people he was going to visit them later when he meant he would stop by and knock on their dormitory door. Story 45. The boss frequently brings in donuts. A Ukrainian coworker decided to try the one with bacon. After taking a bite, he nodded in approval and exclaimed, America. Story 46. I briefly lived in Russia in 2003 and went to the mall with a friend. While there, we encountered someone my friend knew, and we started talking in Russian. The man asked where I was from and said I sounded British. I told him I was from Los Angeles. He suddenly exclaimed, "Ah, Los Angeles," with a strong emphasis on the last word. I responded, "Whoa, whoa, let's never say that again, shall we?" Story 47. When my British friend visited me in the United States, we passed a school bus while riding around town. He was shocked and excited that they existed. I thought it was cute how enthusiastic he was about a school bus. Story 48. We hosted an exchange student from Spain when I was 12 or 13 years old. We went bowling with a large group and I ordered a root beer. She exclaimed, "But you can't drink that. You have to be 21 here." I explained that it was a soft drink and that I was not drinking beer on a weekday afternoon as a preteen. Story 49. I used to live in Chicago. When I traveled outside the country, I told people where I lived, and more than one person pretended to fire a machine gun along with sound effects, as if it were still Prohibition and Al Capone was in charge. Story 50. Hello, I hope you don't mind. I used to see news headlines from the United States like, "Free meals for veterans," and for years thought people in the US just really liked animals. Eventually, I found out that vet in US English is short for Army veteran, not veterinarian. Also, I thought for decades that peanut butter and jelly sandwiches contain Jell-O because in British English, jelly refers to Jell-O. Story 51. A French man once told me, I think Americans dislike taxes because they receive nothing in return. In France, they provide us with benefits. It's not humorous, but I will never forget it. Story 52. I was working as a user research consultant when our clients from South Korea visited San Francisco to observe some of our home visits for customer research. At the first home we visited, we were greeted by a 400-pound woman in a stained dress. She was a hoarder and had pet waste on the floor and firearms everywhere. I tried to get through the interview as quickly as possible because they looked absolutely terrified. When we got back in the car, they were silent for a while. Finally, one of them asked, "Are most American homes like this?" Story 53. Why do you chat with every cashier? Asked one of my German exchange sons incredulously. Look, kid, the job is tough, it's underpaid, and corporate executives insist on making them stand. The least I can do is be pleasant. Story 54. I lived in Southeast Asia for a year. Anytime I mentioned I was from Texas, I would first get asked if I was from Dallas, apparently the only city people know. I would occasionally get asked, "Cowboy." Once, a taxi driver asked if we had casinos. Story 55. A Japanese man told me that American men can crush apples with their bare hands. He asked me if I could. He seemed eager for me to say yes. I probably can't, so I honestly said I had never tried to avoid disappointing him. Luckily, neither of us had an apple available. Story 56. I was in Argentina having espresso with a coworker and commented that I couldn't find a cup of coffee anywhere. He rolled his eyes and said, "You Americans with your big coffee, big cars, and big donuts." The way he emphasized it made it pretty funny. Story 57. In high school, we had a foreign exchange student from Slovakia. She thought it was strange that she couldn't drink at school. She brought alcohol in a water bottle and took sips from it occasionally. We told her she could be expelled for that, and she was quite confused about why underage drinking was such a big deal in America. Story 58. An Israeli couple asked me why we use a giant rodent to predict when spring will come. Groundhog Day never seemed odd until I had to explain it. Story 59. My German family members seem to think we only eat processed American cheese, that all our sausages are hot dogs, that all our bread is Wonder Bread, and that all the beer is light and served on ice. I live in Wisconsin, where we enjoy beer, cheese, and bratwurst quite well. Story 60. I had a friend come over from Belgium, and she was shocked, saying, "There is so much wildlife up close." The wildlife in question, squirrels and deer we passed by while driving. She couldn't believe that our area had so much more wildlife that she wasn't seeing, including bears, coyotes, and beavers. She also didn't understand how dangerous tornadoes were. Story 61. An Australian guy once said it's strange that they use the term petrol instead of gas for filling up their car. Why do you call it gas? It's a liquid, mate. Story 62. It wasn't said to me directly, but I read somewhere that earlier this year, when TikTok was down in the United States, many users migrated over to Red Note. For a couple of days, there was an unmoderated cultural exchange between users from the United States and China, where they asked each other questions. My absolute favorite question I saw a Chinese citizen ask an American was, "Why do you eat like your healthcare is free?" Story 63. In Egypt in 1989, I was asked if I knew Michael Jackson or Madonna. I was also asked where I lived, New York or Los Angeles. Story 64. I had a classmate from Korea with whom I would converse casually. One day, they asked if America is a country or a collection of countries on one continent. They wondered if those countries could be considered continents if there were even more countries within them. They also asked whether people from the United States really vacation in other countries. They were inquiring whether the states are separate countries and if the parishes or counties within each state are also countries. Story 65. I asked them to do their best impression of an American accent, and they replied in a country accent, "Howdy y'all." They also mentioned that apples and peanut butter were one of the weirdest combinations they had tried. Story 66. A Mexican coworker was told we have a celebration on Friday, and that's why we're so happy when Friday arrives. He was instructed to say Happy Friday to us and observe our reactions. Story 67. It wasn't about America, but I had a German friend who had never heard the word Cajun out loud, so he confidently ordered the Cajun chicken. Story 68. My mother told my sisters to get over here when they were running off. We had Australian friends visiting us and were horrified. In our context, fanny means but. It turns out that fanny does not mean but in Australia. Story 69. My friend and I asked an Australian guy at our local bar why he was dressed so fancy. He said, "I'm not American. When I go out, I don't dress like," and gestured to us wearing hoodies and jeans. Story 70. I was talking with some exchange students from Europe about firearms. They asked me how many I owned. They were shocked to learn that the closest thing I had to a firearm was some old paintball gear and a longbow. They asked if we could go to Walmart to buy some. They were again surprised when I told them there is not a single supermarket near me that sells firearms or ammunition. You need to go to a gun store or an outdoor store. They also wouldn't be able to purchase them anyway. They probably wouldn't pass a background check, and they wouldn't be here long enough to get past the waiting period. Waiting period? They didn't seem to understand that individual states set their own gun laws and that I lived in one of the strictest states in the country at the time. They thought the laws in Montana applied here. They also seemed to think I could easily obtain an automatic weapon. They clearly knew gun models from video games or movies because they mentioned specific models. They were confused when I explained tax stamps and how automatics were well beyond what most people could obtain without significant money and bureaucratic approval. So I decided to introduce them to my uncle, who hunts and has a decent collection. We planned to do some target shooting with a .22 rifle, but they lost interest when we went through the safety rules. We handed them props to help them get used to holding firearms so they could learn muzzle awareness and trigger discipline. However, just 5 minutes after we told them not to, they pointed the props at each other and looked down the barrels. I overheard one of them say to the other, "I was expecting cowboys, but we found the Stasi instead." Story 71. The countless people on the internet who believe we do not have electric kettles available for purchase at any department store or regular grocery store. Story 72. I'm visiting Montreal right now and went to watch a Spurs Europa game at an English pub. I sat next to another Spurs supporter. He seemed to be about 30 years older than me. I'm a woman as well, but we definitely had good banter. He reminded me of my friends back home. Well, he received a call to schedule a CAT scan or something. He was writing it down and explaining the appointment when he looked over at me smugly and said, "It's free." I don't know why I laughed so much. I replied, "You don't have to be smug about it." Not sure if this applies to your question, but it was hilarious. He later said that the one good thing about Trump is that he has united all of Canada against him. Story 73. We were joking with a French colleague at work, and he said, "Your mouth is as full of lies as your bagels are of cream cheese." Story 74. I had a guy wearing a Call of Duty shirt and a Yankees hat tell me that the United States has no culture. He might as well have been eating a hot dog while saying it. Story 75. This probably isn't what you had in mind, but I went back to England with my English grandmother, who left in her 20s after marrying a soldier. Her brother told her she spoke with an American accent. Story 76. Not me specifically, but when I was in Afghanistan, an obnoxious Marine was going on and on about how much better America is compared to the rest of the world, considering it was his first time leaving the continental United States. A British soldier looked at him dead in the eyes and said, "I'm not going to argue with someone whose country is younger than my doorknobs." I was in stitches. Story 77. This doesn't quite fit the question, but my husband is from England. He speaks with a strong Cockney accent. In the past, whenever someone, including myself, would ask him why he came to the United States, his answer was always, "To drink your beer and get to know your women." Somehow, it always resulted in him making a new friend instead of ending up in a bar fight. And he gained a wife out of it. Story 78. They just serve you the water? But you have a drought. Story 79. I asked my new Mexican friend in Mexico, "What is the hardest genre of American music to understand?" She replied with a completely straight face, "How do you call it? That type of rap." I wasn't mad. She's in a different culture. But I almost fell over laughing. Story 80. My Canadian friend kept teasing us for treating every food as a vehicle for ranch dressing. The thing is, he loved mayonnaise. Now I ask you, my fellow Americans, what is ranch but more flavorful mayonnaise? Story 81. I once had the pleasure of being seated next to an older English gentleman on a flight from Frankfurt to Boston. He had a Winston Churchill and John Houseman vibe, and though I didn't ask, I believe he was someone of distinction, perhaps a member of parliament or a former politician. We made small talk and eventually discussed geopolitics and culture. At some point, he said the following, "You know what the greatest thing is about America? America always gets it right. They try everything else first, but in the end, they get it right." Story 82. I often see these questions about other countries, and it is usually Americans making humorous comments, but this can go the other way sometimes. I had an Irish woman tell me that Louisiana smells because a bad wind is funneled down from Canada between the Rocky and Appalachian Mountains. Story 83. I was helping a recently immigrated teenage boy from Ethiopia make sense of the novels taught in his American literature classes, and I grew quite fond of him. One day, I asked him what the most surprising changes he encountered were. He very politely told me he wasn't used to women having rights. As I tried not to choke with laughter, he added, "Dogs too." Story 84. I'm landing in Seattle on Friday, and my flight leaves on Monday. I would like to see Yellowstone and Mount Rainier. Story 85. Do you know J.R. Ewing? This was in the mid-1980s, and the show Dallas was extremely popular everywhere. The same person asked me about cowboy hats. Story 86. This was an exchange my wife had with a cashier at a drugstore in Vancouver, Canada. She was paying for postage stamps with a US $10 bill when the cashier said, "Your money looks funny." Without skipping a beat, my wife replied, "So does yours." I had to stifle a laugh. Story 87. I was in Germany, stuck at a train station for 2 hours due to construction. A member of the crew commented that all Americans are lazy. During my time at the station, the crew seemed inactive. Occasionally, one person would move a tool, but the 20 crew members were mostly on their phones for the entire duration of my wait. Story 88. Why do you ask me how I am doing? I never thought of it before, but I understand why a 19-year-old from the Czech Republic would find it mildly rude and annoying, particularly when no one here waits to hear your answer. Story 89. Vastly underestimating distances within the United States. I think the 50 states confuse people. They simply do not understand that the distance from San Francisco to New York City, approximately 2,950 miles, is similar to the distance from Paris to the North Pole, approximately 2,850 miles. Story 90. You all seem to think we literally drive around shooting at each other out of our car windows all day, which is actually quite funny but also a little sad. It is amusing when Europeans, in particular, wildly misunderstand and underestimate distances here. Story 91. Years ago, I visited my family in New Zealand. They asked, "Do all station wagons in America have wood paneling?" Story 92. A man from Japan once told me that the hardest thing to get used to in the United States is all the different hair colors. This was in the 1980s, so it may not be true anymore. Story 93. When I was 18, I met a German at a hookah bar who was genuinely shocked that New York City was still standing. He said he thought it had been entirely destroyed on September 11th and that everyone who survived lived underground, creating an entire underground city. No, I am not joking. I said, I partially grew up in Manhattan, so I can attest that it still exists above ground. Yes, there is a New York underground, but the skyscrapers are still there. I haven't talked to the guy since, but a friend heard that the following year, he went to visit and make sure it was true. Story 94. I was living in Africa many years ago and met a German traveler on a bus. He asked me, "Are you Canadian?" I said, "No, I'm American." He replied, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I said, "No problem. The accents are very similar." He responded, "Oh, good. I'm glad you are not upset. If I ask a Canadian if they are American, they often become very angry. Americans never mind though, so if I am not sure, I always ask if someone is Canadian." We both laughed. Story 95. I am from Texas and live in Dallas, a large modern city. A young lady from Sweden once asked me, "So, not everyone in Texas rides a horse?" At an information technology convention, a German asked me where he could go to buy cowboy boots. I shop at Nordstrom. I have no idea what you are talking about. Story 96. All we ever talk about is our country. This may or may not be true, but this person makes being Australian his entire personality, which I found amusing. Story 97. It has become a prevalent meme that many people do not fully understand the vastness of America. I have encountered this notion several times, despite being relatively young. A friend's extended family visited them in New York and casually suggested taking the train to Disney World for the afternoon. I have also known foreign exchange students who were shocked that we discussed a day trip to a city just a 2-hour drive away. This is only tangentially related to the topic, but during a study abroad program in Tanzania, I witnessed a large truck stuck in the mud. After we helped get the truck out and began cheering, the locals remarked on how loud we were. They appeared somewhat bewildered by our exuberance. It was a lighthearted moment, but it remains with me as a clear example of cultural differences. Even though, in my experience, Tanzanians are quite talkative. They are never loud but are extremely engaging, which I appreciated. Story 98. Germans in Africa. I was on safari with a large group in the Serengeti. Over some drinks, a couple of German women confidently told me that the United States has no meaningful culture. I asked them if they were fans of jazz. They said yes, of course. Hip-hop, of course. I pointed at their jeans and asked, "Do you wear jeans often?" "Yes, of course." Eventually, they realized where I was leading them and said, "Well, it's not the same." Yes, you see, culture is only considered culture if it can be packaged up in a single item. I also pointed out that, as a Jewish American, I have a unique culture distinct from the broader American context, but at that point they were too sheepish to really engage. English person in Canada. I was in Banff with a friend, and a Brit struck up a conversation with us. It came out that we are American, and they said something like, "Oh, I didn't know Americans were really into outdoor activities. That one haunts me. How could anyone even begin to imagine that?" Story 99. I was in a fresh market in China buying eggs when a man asked me if they had eggs in my country. The best part was that as I looked at him, trying to figure out whether he was serious, the other people around us started making fun of him and calling him foolish. We all had a great laugh. Story 100. In Chamonix a few years ago, while sitting at the hotel bar, a large Norwegian man quietly sat next to me. Donald Trump was on the television talking. The man turned to me in heavily accented English and asked, "Why have you Americans lost your taste for assassination?" I laughed out loud, then looked around as if to say, "Sure, we can't talk about that." Story 101. They thought they could catch a bus to go from one coast to the other in less than a day. They didn't realize how large the United States is. Story 102. The conversation I had in Japan with some Japanese students revealed that they were planning a trip to the United States in the summer. Their plan was to visit New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, the Grand Canyon, Las Vegas, Miami, and Chicago. This trip was to last 2 to 3 weeks, and they intended to drive to each destination. They thought we were joking when we mentioned that it was practically impossible. In a similar situation, I was talking to a British friend I had made who expressed how challenging it is to be so far away from her family and boyfriend while on campus. The distance, which was just over an hour by train, sparked a disagreement because I referred to that distance as close. This experience taught me 2 important lessons. 1. Non-Americans often have no concept of how large the United States is. And 2. Our perception of distance is very different. Story 103. I retired from an American subsidiary of a German company. It was tradition to host 3 or 4 students each summer. They worked in different areas based on their interests. Managers were encouraged to interact with them to help them feel welcome and comfortable, as most had never been to the United States before. One student, when I asked what he wanted to experience while he was here, said he wanted to visit a donut shop and have one of Homer Simpson's pink donuts with sprinkles. Story 104. In the mid-1980s in France, at a restaurant, a British man recognized our American accents and uninvitedly pulled a chair over to our table. He did not introduce himself and proceeded to criticize Americans as uncouth, loud, and intrusive. His wife got up and left the restaurant, leaving us with him. It was an unpleasant experience. Story 105. I am biracial, and the first non-American person I ever met was concerned that my parents had been jailed. But they did not get married until 1970, so it was legal. It was an interesting conversation, and I have many memories about it. Story 106. I had 2 French friends stay with me, and we made a fire and prepared s'mores. They were amazed. They had only ever seen tiny marshmallows in hot chocolate in movies and had never understood how s'mores worked. They had so much fun making them. I created the perfect golden marshmallow crunch layer with the chocolate oozing out from the crackers and had them try that one first. Their eyes widened when they took a bite. Story 107. While in Mexico, someone asked me if everyone in the United States has high-paying office jobs. I told him no, to which he replied, "It doesn't make sense that Americans vote for presidents who don't relate to working people." Story 108. A person I was speaking to in Ireland mentioned that when he visited Chicago, he couldn't believe that Lake Michigan had a tide. I responded, "Well, it's over 300 miles long and over 100 miles wide at its broadest point." Story 109. They typically misunderstand distances and the size of the country. They will say they plan to visit New York and then drive to Las Vegas in a week-long trip. Good luck with that. It's 2,525 miles, or 4,064 kilometers. Even with shorter distances, a British friend visited San Francisco and mentioned they could drive down to San Diego. When I told them it would be a 7-hour drive on a good day, they were surprised. They can drive across their entire country in 3 hours. Additionally, they had never experienced a drive that long. Story 110. In 1985, I was 11, and my family moved to Norway from Houston, Texas. I was enrolled in 6th grade at the local school, and the children had many questions for me, thinking I lived on a ranch and rode a horse to school. They also asked if I knew JR from the show Dallas. Story 111. I don't seem American. You aren't loud, and you are very smart. It is enjoyable talking to you, not just fun. Usually, Americans are just fun. Story 112. Some guy on Reddit asked, "Don't you have to pledge an oath to your current president? Just check a few comments back on my profile and you will find it there." Story 113. I was paying for our meal at a cafe in Paris. We were off to the side next to the serving area when the maitre d' brought over a bottle of liquor and a couple of glasses. He asked, "Would you like to have a shot with me?" I panicked a little because we were supposed to be leaving, and I really didn't have time to hang out getting drunk with the staff. However, I didn't want to be rude. I mean, the guy wanted a shot with me, right? He noticed me stammering and said, "All I know about Americans is that if you want to be friends, you drink shots." I burst out laughing and replied, "Yeah, that will about do it." I declined the second shot but thanked him profusely. Story 114. I live in Central Europe. A man told me that when he was young, he thought everyone in the United States was black because he watched the National Basketball Association. Story 115. A friend told me a long time ago, after she saw a band from Germany perform here, that the singer looked out into the crowd and said, "Portland is chubby." Story 116. Had someone in the Philippines who believed that all predominantly white countries were American, including all of Europe and Australia. Story 117. We spell words differently, such as color versus color and gray versus gray. These variations are not wrong. They are simply different. This also applies to different words for the same objects, like bangs versus fringe. Various countries have distinct spellings and terminology for identical items. It is frustrating to suggest that someone's language is wrong simply because it differs from another. Story 118. A German man tried to explain that Christmas is better in Germany because they decorate trees with candle lights. Confused, I asked if he meant actual candles or just lights that resemble candles. He confirmed they use actual candles, so I asked if that wasn't dangerous. What if the tree catches on fire? He assured me that it doesn't happen. I'm not sure how common this practice is, but it seems the risk of a house fire makes Christmas in Germany better than in America. Story 119. I was at a restaurant in Morocco with some friends from the United Kingdom, and I made a comment that the ketchup was unusually sweet compared to what one would find in the United States. One person started laughing and said, "Is something too sweet for an American?" Story 120. An Australian I know said very emphatically that the land of the mountain lion, bobcat, coyote, wolf, bear, buffalo, and moose had some nerve to go on about how scary Australian wildlife is. You just casually live and go camping where there are apex predators and megafauna all around. And you fight them with pepper spray. You know how their accent goes up at the end, especially when they're excited. It's cute. Anyway, I realized that checking your shoes for aggressive and deadly spiders is a lot less work than having to replace all the outdoor trash cans with bear-proof ones because they are getting smarter. Story 121. I remember a comment suggesting that Americans were unwise for rotating their food plates. An American adjusts a plate to their liking, which does not harm or affect others in any way. Those Americans. Story 122. I was at a bar getting drinks with some friends a number of years ago, and we ended up talking to a random guy there. He was visiting from Australia. I started asking him how his trip was and what he thought of the country so far. He said, "You know, mate, we're in Texas, but it's way less America than I was expecting." I had no idea what he meant by that, but later he commented on how excited he was when he saw a guy riding a horse downtown. The idea that this Australian man was expecting everyone in Texas to be a gun-toting cowboy is still funny to me to this day. Story 123. My Spanish friend was here and saw an ice cream truck. She looked off into the distance whimsically and said, "It's true." Story 124. I had someone from the United Kingdom try to tell me that there were no roundabouts in America, not a single one. I told them that there were multiple within a couple of miles of my house, and they said I didn't know what a roundabout was. I walked to the roundabout at the end of the street I lived on, took a selfie with it, and sent it to them. They responded by calling me a stupid American. That's true, but I'm not sure what it had to do with roundabouts. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.